So the discussions, typically they happen online because I'm obliged to. The minute I give people the opportunity to not attend class, but to stream the class, it becomes, in the eyes of the college, an online class. And there's been a lot of back and forth about this. But what it basically means is, as soon as it's an online class, I must demonstrate people having active participation every week, which means not just posting, but also discussing within a post,
right.
okay? So I don't think it's fair that folks who come and attend class face-to-face regularly and who engage in a discussion also have to go home and actually do that two-step process at home, basically. So what I'm trying this semester, and all of this is like highly irregular. This is the only classroom that streams in the college, and we are one of 2 departments that actually do this. And like I said, there's been a lot of back and forth with the distance education people. So right now, what I decided this semester, which if you guys feel it's unfair, we can make some accommodations or some adjustments. But basically what I decided was that people who came and participated in the discussion on, during class time would get extra credit. So essentially you would not get, you would get a 0 for the online discussion, but you would get the same number of points as extra credit for doing the classroom discussion.
Yeah.
So how do we all feel about that? Is that okay?
That sounds all right.
Chris? Okay. But Rick, you were saying 5 or 10. I mean, to me, it's all 10.
It's all 10. Okay.
Right.
I mean, they're worth the same amount, basically, because my view is the in-class discussion should simply
That makes sense.
be equivalent.
I didn't think about it like that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, this is
Because you're kind of replying in class.
What I did, like when I was replying when I was doing it online, it's like I try to get my homework done as quickly as possible. So I would that's why I was the first one to post on a couple of them. But then I gotta wait for people to make their post, and then I gotta go through
On
it and
Sunday
then reply.
night,
So
yeah,
it's always that late
Yeah.
night, you know,
yeah,
on Sunday. So
yeah.
I think
So-
writing is better for me.
Well, I noticed that some people who do attend the class or who could turn in a paper for the class discussion instead go home and write it.
I just edit
Yeah.
Which I think
too
is
much, so I would have to scratch it. Like, I'd rather just do it online.
yeah.
When I'm writing, I edit it.
I mean, whatever works for you guys is best. But
Yeah.
you know, what I found is that it seemed to me to be a huge advantage to give people the opportunity to stream and not come in and archive. But then as soon as they jumped on me and said, well, now it's a distance class and you have to have a discussion every week, and then I thought, oh my God, so why, it brings in the most demanding parts of an online class into what I'd hoped to be would just be a more convenient form of face-to-face class.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's like, because those weekly discussions are, it's just something you have to keep up with.
Yeah.
So this is a compromise so far. We'll see how it goes, but if
Sure, you're dealing with a lot of red tape and
yeah, I mean it's
bureaucratic
it's
stuff in college.
well, particularly because this is an unknown. So the people who are afraid that we'll get dinged for having irregular distance learning classes, which are such a big part of the college plan nowadays. Yeah. So, most online classes are just like online classes. It's you and a keyboard, and if I make a video, it's like I sit in my office, I record a video, versus here, it's like every class.
Yeah.
And for me, I mean, I do a regular lecture class. I also don't want to have to do all the online work on top of it.
Exactly.
Yeah, but whatever. Okay, we don't want to take too much time away from this.
Makes sense.
I hope we're good. And if we're not, we can, also make adjustments. And I mean, already an adjustment I would say is that, although it's probably demanding to sit in class and write down on a paper and stuff, I would like to hear from everybody in class when we have a discussion. So let's build that in next time. That if you are going to turn in a paper as a kind of an extra credit discussion thing, at least speak up in class about it. Okay, so I'll remind people next time. I'm doing them on Tuesdays, so if you want to take advantage of that, then it's on Tuesdays. Thursdays are going to become, I can tell, a more or less frantic catch-up in terms of looking at the major things that are in the textbook. So, hello. Okay, and we are, okay, this came up to the front. Here, get on this. So for those who didn't turn in their discussion paper, it's due Sunday night. Just a reminder about that. And I should send out emails about all that too. Okay, so let's pick up the story of the history of radio. We looked into early developments, especially the inventors who collaborated in making radio what it is we know today. And you know, key players were Marconi, Fessenden, DeForest, and Armstrong, who's not there on the list because he comes back later in the chapter. There's a little sidebar about his conflictual relationship with David Sarnoff, who was the head of NBC, and Armstrong, you know, single-handedly created the FM radio and poured a lot of his money into research radio stations, which he hoped would become, you know, the sort of industry leaders as soon as the industry switched over to FM. But his business partner, Sarnoff, they weren't officially partners, but Sarnoff had, you know, groomed him and brought his technology to RCA, and Armstrong had become a millionaire through that, you know, kind of deal making. Well, Sarnoff wanted to suppress FM so that television could kind of be the next boom of consumer electronics, and so Armstrong was you know, disappointed, thwarted, lost a lot of his money in those early radio stations, and then in the legal battles that ensued, and eventually he became despondent and committed suicide. So we looked at those folks. Also, and then we evoked a few key historical moments, certainly in terms of bringing the consciousness of radio to the public. The sinking of the Titanic was a big moment where, you know, radio had actually been involved in distress signaling and getting a ship out too late, but to help the few survivors that were out there. World War I brought about a suspension of patent rights, and so this was a big step in improving the technology, because up till then, different inventors had been fighting each other about who actually owned key parts of radio. But during World War I, they were able to just simply make the best radio system they possibly could. And then you hit the beginning of radio as a mass medium. So as we mentioned last class, one of the fascinating things about reading back to the you know, the newspaper accounts and the think pieces that were published was that nobody really thought of radio as a mass medium. And it took a forward-thinking executive like David Sarnoff to think, well, this might not just be a, you know, electronic telegraph. This could be an entertainment system, you know. So he conceived of, well, he wrote a memo called the Radio Music Box Memo. And the idea there was that radio, I don't have a slide, or I probably do have a slide, is written on it somewhere else. So radio, you know, could become kind of in-home source of free entertainment, which turned out to be very, very attractive to consumers who wanted, you know, to have, you know, they didn't need a record player. They could get, you know, the latest entertainment stars into their living rooms that way. And also Sarnoff wrote other stuff. And again, if you look into the New York Times, you'll see discussions about, well, how will we pay for this, you know, entertainment? And Sarnoff thought up a future, envisioned a future where there would be 3 gigantic broadcast systems that would, you know, cover the country. He thought they would actually be like super high-powered antennas or something that they would construct, and it could cover the whole country. And that doesn't work out because radio has its physical limitations, but they moved in and eventually through the network system accomplished the same thing. So although it was a variation on that idea, they wound up with ABC, CBS, and NBC covering the entire country as they worked through it. Before those networks were created, there was a good deal of kind of local entrepreneurial activity, right? So KDKA is, the call letters of an early broadcaster, local broadcaster, and so actual radio stations are still licensed on a local level. Like, the CBS radio network does not have a license to be a network, it's simply a business, but every station in that network actually has an individual license. And so this was the work of what was first called the Federal Radio Commission and then the Federal Communication Commission that we have now. Part of their job is to grant licenses to local stations that, and so still to this day, KGO or a KMEL, each of those stations has an individual license. Now, they are maybe owned by large ownership groups. They may collaborate together like national public radio stations do in a network that shares content, but they're licensed on a local level. So, and early on, it was simply entrepreneurs who would get the equipment and start broadcasting. But they ran into a problem of like, well, where are we going to get enough stuff to put on the airwaves? I'm an amateur engineer and I've got in my garage the equipment necessary to, put out an AM signal which will cover part of my city. But, who's going to play? Who's going to talk? My uncle, my kids, the people down the street. And so eventually you run out of stuff to put on the radio, So the notion of a network really becomes important in terms of sharing high quality content across a lot of stations. They pretty soon realize it works better if we produce the shows and then we distribute them like that. So if you look at the number of stations, there's just quite a huge boom, right? Between 22 and 23. As more and more people go on the air, and a lot of these early engineer operators would have encountered radio first as maybe radio techs in the First World War or stuff like that. So a lot of them were trained up that way. Some of them were amateurs who were just really handy with it. So here became the problem, was like how to generate revenue. Like how could you pay for all of this, right? And they came up with this concept, which is what networks are today. They called it chain broadcasting back in those days. So one station sends a signal to another station via telephone lines, and then the content actually gets aired simultaneously. So what do we call it, a medium where something is aired simultaneously? It was synchronous, right? Yeah, right. So here we got the recognition that for this to be really powerful, it should be synchronous. We should all have the same content. And then we have old media, like long-distance telephone lines, distributing out the content to each of these stations. The new media at the time was radio, right? So that's an interesting lesson to be learned. Just the way we get our internet connections through the phone line or through cable TV, back in those days, they were sending out the programming through long-distance phone lines, which is how AT&T became a central part of broadcasting. Their part of the pie was creating those lines that would send the signal out to the networks. And AT&T actually had a blue set of lines and a red set of lines on their blueprints, or whatever they were, their org charts. And so they had the red and the blue networks, they called them, for NBC. And NBC ultimately was forced to say, you're too powerful. Congress said, you're too powerful, you got too much. So they were forced to divest the blue, and that's what became ABC a little bit later on in those networks. So early on, networks were created to share content, be more efficient, and that was called chain broadcasting. Wow, okay. Meanwhile, artists had to get paid for their work on this, and the copyright of the day was, even as it is today, it's kind of lags behind technical developments, technological developments. So back in the day, copyright was mainly directed at rewarding composers for the songs that they wrote. That was the biggest business, right? Because otherwise, there wasn't much recorded music. It wasn't a big part of any industry. But people who wrote popular songs wanted to get paid for them. With radio, also comes up the rights collection agencies that we have nowadays. ASCAP, we have BMI, we have another one called CSAC. So these are companies which are designed to get the payment of royalties for creative work that is used on the radio. And still to this day, they do that. And if we have time, we'll come back to it. So check it out. As we said, between 1922 and 1923, you get an explosion of stations that go on the air, but they run into the problem of what should we put on the air. And so it's solved in one way through chain broadcasting, and NBC is created in 1926 under David Sarnoff as a string of chain broadcasting stations. A lot of them are owned independently, and they join up and sign contracts with the network that supplies them content and eventually advertising too. Do you know what do we call a station that is part of a network? An affiliate, right, that's right.
Subsidiary?
Well, that would be a company which is like a subsidiary of another company. So affiliate, I'm sure you guys have heard it. The NBC affiliate in this area is in San Jose, making it hard to get terrestrial video, but anyhow. So affiliate network relationships exist at that time. Oh my goodness. So the Radio Act of 27 creates the FRC, the Federal Radio Commission. So as the business takes off and they realize, wow, there's a lot of money to be made in providing radio to individual consumers, but we've got to make sure that stations compete on a fair basis. So basically, the government has to get involved a certain amount to regulate the use of the airwaves in order to create a viable business. So that's what the FRC did, the Federal Radio Commission, and I think it becomes the FCC, the Federal Communications Commission, in 33 or 34. There it is, Communications Act. So what do we know about the FCC? What do we hear about the FCC nowadays? When do we hear about them most often? Legacy?
When they censor things?
When they censor things, that's right, yeah. So like, wardrobe malfunctions, or someone lets go with an F-bomb or something during an award show or something like that. So we do hear about them in their role as regulating content. That's a pretty small part of their job compared to, the granting of licenses and stuff.
Family Guy did a whole episode on the FCC.
Yes, I did see that with Peter.
Yes.
Yeah, which was full of stuff that was kind of like just, at the very edge of what was permissible.
Right.
Yeah, it was.
And then they tried to censor him in real life when he got out the shower.
Yeah, I read all about that one. I actually showed it I have a TV criticism class at San Francisco State. It starts tonight, and I have another one tomorrow morning.
Nice.
We do that kind of stuff. We don't look at as much content in this class as I would love to. So a big part, apart from the content regulation, is also the granting of licenses, making sure that the thing will work as a business. It often comes up in tension between broadcasters and the regulator. The idea, well, we've got free speech rights here in the United States. How dare you, government, come in and tell us what we're not allowed to say? And so an important part of working out the Radio Act and leading into the mandate of the FCC is justifying why should we regulate this business whatsoever. And so this is a real central thing you'll see in broadcasting. Congress makes the argument, which is sustained today, that stations must operate in public interest, convenience, and necessity, because the airwaves are a public good, just like the land of the United States belongs to the American people, and if you want to go drilling for oil, you need to get, permission to do it. And the government also says, well, some places you can't do that because it's a natural wildlife preserve or it's too close to people or stuff like that. In the same way, if you want to, make money off of the airwaves, you have to submit to a certain amount of government intervention, whether it's licensing, technical issues, or content sometimes. But this still comes up with really high-profile challenges. The broadcasters, whenever they get fined, typically they went as far as the Supreme Court a couple of times to challenge the FCC's, right to limit their content and stuff. So it's an ongoing kind of struggle with, basically the networks and the broadcasters try to avoid as much regulation as they can, and the FCC, depending on whether it's either Republican or Democrat dominated, either sort of let them go do what they want to do or try to, work more in the public interest, typically. So the first of the chain networks was NBC. And I just want to see, when do we get to talking about CBS? Maybe on that same slide, or maybe not at all. I mean, it's really important that we mention also, sorry about that, my slides don't appear to be as complete as they should. A year after NBC's launched, it was 1926, 1927. Well, you have the UIB, but it is bought up, I believe, by Columbia Records, and then a businessman named William Paley buys up the Columbia Record Company and creates, and with UIB it becomes, I think, CBS. And we could look that up, or I'm sure it's in the textbook. But CBS enters the field very soon after NBC, a competing network. And they're the two big networks until Congress forces NBC to divest, which creates ABC. Gosh, okay. So we said the competition is a big thing that goes on. Obviously, NBC and CBS competing for stars and for advertiser dollars. But also radio itself competes with the existing mass media of the time, especially newspapers. And at first, newspapers looked with a lot of fear on radio, because radio could basically scoop them in real time. If you think about newspapers, that's an asynchronous medium. It published a couple times a day, typically in the morning and the evening editions. And so people were used to waiting for their news. But radio can bring them breaking news as it happens. So newspapers were scared about that. But what they did have on their side was, legions of trained journalists and news operations and such. And so what they did do was that they forbade radio from using their material. And there were early, news sharing organizations, what we call news wires nowadays, the Associated Press or whatever. And they wouldn't do business with radio until in 1933, they had what they called the Biltmore Agreement, which is the Biltmore Hotel in New York City. They signed a cooperative agreement, which was basically radio could use their news, but they had to not scoop them. They had to wait until the afternoon or early evening newspaper publication window closed before they could then use that information. How do you think that worked out? It was violated relatively quickly, but it kind of opened the door to that. Oh my gosh, Second World War. This, I think, is, Armstrong had functional FM radio in the mid-30s. Sarnoff nixed it and they began their battle. But like we still have AM and FM. Are you like, what do you listen to mostly on AM? How about comparing sound quality? What sounds better, AM or FM?
FM.
FM?
They kind of stopped developing AM once FM came along.
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's a kind of a long history,
Yeah.
but there is, for instance, AM stereo, and
Yeah.
nobody actually broadcasts in that. So they could, that would have made AM better, but they kind of let it go.
I read there's like a small push to try and
Bring that.
AM alive again.
Oh,
Yeah.
You know, it's very powerful. The signal travels a long way compared to FM. You know, so all the biggest news stations in a market will be AM stations.
What's on AM nowadays?
Talk, mostly talk, because
NPR.
Pardon me?
NPR.
NPR it's on FM.
Really?
Oh,
Yeah,
really?
it's on FM. Yeah, like KQED, KLW.
Didn't it start off on AM?
It probably did, because just about everything was on AM until, you know,
Right.
1960s is when FM took off. Yeah. So FM has superior sound quality. It's, you know, freedom from interference. So it makes, you know, more sense to put music onto FM radio. But yeah, Legacy?
I think oldies are on AM too.
Yeah, and you know, and that speaks to, like, you know, an earlier, exactly right. You know, everyone had an AM radio. They didn't necessarily have an AM FM radio, and they hung. You know, old people hang on. Being one of them, we hang on to our old stuff for a long time. So, you know. So, you know, FM, although it existed and it was a superior system, through the 30s and 40s, nothing much was happening with it till the end of the 50s, basically, which is, you know, in the little video we watched last week, it talked about popular music saving FM and saving radio itself. So when young people became more interested in pop music, and radio became a great promotional system for, you know, single sales or album sales into the 1970s. Then, you know, radio found this whole new sort of low-cost, relatively profitable content. You know, they had to give up what they did in the early days of radio and switched over to music programming. And so that's when FM really took off in the 60s and 70s, because people actually cared about, you know, the sound quality at that point. So that was a big shift. And what we're seeing now is that, you know, if you want to have good quality audio, you're putting it on FM, you know, AM is for powerful stations that have news and talk, basically. That's the way it's shaken out. We'll see a little bit more about programming in 2 weeks from this week. I think we're working on it. Anything else to look at there? This. Hello.
I don't know if this is relevant, but like the hardware back then, did you have to get a separate radio for AM and a separate radio for FM?
They combined them eventually, but yeah, primarily it was like AM receivers, because people were thinking, like, yeah, who needs this, right?
Yeah.
So another big thing was transistorization, which I think happened in the 1960s. Again, sorry, I'm like not an encyclopedia of these things, but yeah, yes. So it allows you to shrink everything and to, like, you know, I think it makes it easier to put an FM and
Less
AM
heat,
receiver.
too.
Right, and you can put it in your car. Although there were kind of tube car radios in like super premium cars, you know, but they would have been like really big boxes in your car.
Yeah.
So
Record
it
players.
did exist. They had record players in cars, really?
Yeah.
So what happens if the road's bumpy?
I forget who invented it, but it started being put in a lot of Chryslers, and
Wow.
they built like this whole suspension system.
Right, so
Still, I mean, it's still,
gonna jump.
yeah, and it eventually died out
Yeah,
pretty quickly.
I had no idea. That's incredible. Wow, that is so strange. Early days, right?
Sounds like Pimp My Ride.
Right.
Right. What more can we fit into this car?
Yeah.
You laugh now, but it's probably
Oh
gonna
my gosh. So, like I said, in a couple of textbook chapters, we get to a really interesting chapter, which is more about the programming and about, you know, what audiences were really after in the day. But, you know, early AM radio from the, you know, late 20s through the 1950s, the golden age of radio. You know, they had serials like The Shadow, like The Lone Ranger, and we'll talk. You know, there's plenty of other stuff. And if you just YouTube like old time radio, if you search it, there's just tons of it. And so, and they played music, they had news, they had talk, they had everything, basically. It was like a real variety. You know, we used to have variety shows on TV where you did all kinds of things. So radio was really, programming was variety radio. When it switched over to music, at first, you know, they'd play different kinds of music throughout the day, but then the stations settled on a particular station format or identity, and so you got like an easy listening station and a pop station and stuff. So we'll see that in a couple of weeks, how all that programming actually changes over the years, you know. But basically it was television that killed variety radio, you know, because all of those show formats went over to television, and they were so much more popular when they hit TV than they were on radio. That radio was left without much to do. As we saw, it recycled itself effectively playing pre-recorded music. Wow, okay. So I know it's, as I said, a mad dash to catch up on this story. Anyone got satellite radio? Do you, Chris? Did it come with a car?
Well, my mom first bought me like the mobile thing back when I was like 20 or like that, and right before like Howard Stern joined, I got Sirius.
Okay.
And then he came like a year or two later.
Did that cement your interest in it, kind of?
No, I liked it beforehand because I just can't stand all the commercials.
Oh yeah.
On radio.
And it's worse now.
And it's worse. And then it's like you get like 20 or 30-minute blocks of
could be
commercials
at night, yeah. But definitely 10-minute blocks are totally common.
Yeah. And so it was great, and you get more variety too in terms of music.
So you've been like a subscriber for decades. Yeah.
I mean, I cut it off and started it up again, but now I've done it still.
Okay. Is anybody else like interested or used satellite radio? Not much. It came like when I got a car, it came for like 3 months, and then I didn't subscribe. You know? Yeah. Well, it's what's great about it? No commercials, multiple channels, like dozens of channels of narrowly formatted music. So 70s channel, 80s channel, 90s channel,
right,
all that stuff, right? Yeah. And then freedom from FCC regulation in terms of content. So that's another thing. That's why Howard Stern, whoever. Was he a syndicated show before?
Yeah, he was at NBC for a long time, and he was, I forget who he was with after that, but the FCC was just like on him.
Yeah, millions of dollars a year fining them, and because that was so much of his thing, they just kept on doing it.
And he saved like satellite radio too. And he made it like Sirius and XM were both failing. He made it that so that Sirius could eventually buy XM and merge.
Interesting. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So there was, how Congress doesn't like a monopoly, right? And so originally when this new satellite radio system was going to go, they wouldn't let it go until there could be at least 2 competing services, because the idea, which is maybe true sometimes and maybe not, is competition brings the cost down to the customer. So Sirius and XM were separate companies when they launched, but they eventually had to, I think it was like around 2001, was it? It says in the textbook again. But it was a struggle because it was hard to get people to actually pay the subscription fee, because they could get free radio as long as they put up with the advertising. Eventually they had to merge, and so now you only have one satellite broadcaster. So they're free to set their rates as they want, but the client basically says, I don't want to pay this much, or I do for a subscription. So that's an interesting thing to keep looking at, as to how much are people willing to pay for a subscription fee to avoid advertising, usually, because those are the 2 models basically. Either you get it supposedly free, but you have to subject yourself to advertising, or you get it through subscription, and supposedly there's no ads. Although more and more, they're playing around with that formula.
But it's funny how people are willing to pay for like Spotify and Pandora, but they won't pay for satellite.
Yeah.
Like it's a subscription either way.
Yeah, I agree. It's just the Spotify library, is just endless. You get the impression that there's just so much stuff. Hey, Mike, come on in. Can we organize like a desk table for you here? No, you're good? Okay, just let us know.
Have you heard of HD audio?
Yes. Yeah.
Is that like going to come out on satellite radio? It can't be FM.
It is, yeah. Well, what it is it is digital radio through terrestrial channels. So, guys, when we talk about FM and AM, we call them all terrestrial because there's an antenna somewhere that kind of sends out the signal, right? So this, we call it terrestrial, or, old school, FM, AM, right? But satellite radio is what it says, right? There are satellites in orbit around the Earth, basically, and they beam down to either your car or to, a home receiver. I think they still exist. They definitely did at the beginning of it all. And as you drive across the country, you'll go from one satellite to another. We'll hand the signal off. So you could drive, from coast to coast and never have to change the channel if you wanted to stay in satellite. So this is really popular in Europe. Like, are there two L's in satellite? Sorry,
yeah.
There are. Thank you, guys. My spelling is challenged, as are many of my things. So in Europe, they've gotten rid of FM and AM completely, switched entirely over to digital satellite radio, which for those smaller countries makes sense because, like a BBC can cover the entire of England, and also because they have these kind of more, they had broadcasting that was not, it didn't grow up like ours did. Our broadcasting grew up with like tens of thousands of individual stations, many of them owned by mom and pop, and eventually maybe companies bought up a couple hundred of them or something, but we still, out of 10,000 stations, we had maybe, close to 100 owners. So how could you coordinate all of that? Whereas in Europe, you'd have these big central broadcasters, and they basically say, in 5 years, we're eliminating FM and AM, we're going digital, and anybody who doesn't want to join us, you're in deep trouble because they're, and everybody would make these changes. But here in the United States, we've got satellite radio with Sirius XM, and we got terrestrial radio, and we went with a technology called HD radio, which I mentioned it last week, uses something called IBOC, in-band on-channel. So what that means is, if you're at 102.5 FM, you can have, an Edwin Armstrong era FM signal, like old terrestrial broadcasting. You can also, into that signal, put digital information at the same time. So your 102.5 FM carrier frequency can also carry a digital signal of much higher quality, and also it can carry sub-signals. So it can also have HD1, HD2, HD3, depending on how much they compress this digital information. The same frequency can carry all of that. So like a hip hop station could carry, like R&B oldies. It could carry a Spanish language station, which is a huge, growing market. So everybody wants a piece of that. And you could even put in, something really targeted towards smaller, different language communities. Or, in Montreal, where I grew up, there's a huge Haitian immigration population, French-speaking people, and they have their own radio and these subcarriers and stuff. And so community radio can really fly in this type of setup as well. So this is called IBOC. What in band, the band would be 102.5. So in band on channel. Yeah.
And the sound quality is actually a lot better with terrestrial radio versus satellite.
You find FM like better quality?
Like a good comparison is you can listen to like when KQED is broadcasting like like NPR programs, you can switch between satellite or FM and hear the difference.
And what sounds better to you? FM?
FM, yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow, interesting.
Yeah. Satellite's just a little more like tinny kind of
Interesting.
sounding. I mean, it sounds good, but when you compare the two, there's like a weird way.
In theory, it's supposed to be CD quality.
Yeah.
And FM, terrestrial FM, a little bit less. So it's interesting that you're feeling that way. Yeah. So those are, anyhow, these are, terrestrial is still radio as we used to know it. But this iBox system kind of fell flat as well. I mean, Rick, you said, have you ever heard of it? And I don't think probably anybody's ever heard of it. Sirius XM, it's marketed to us. But HD radio, I don't know. I think all the Clear Channel stations actually do it. Clear Channel being iHeartRadio, is one of the biggest of those services. But so definitely has, satellite and this form of digital radio has not led to the demise of over-the-air broadcasting. But for the moment, one of its weaknesses is that it doesn't offer local channels. So there's 70s channels, 80s channels on Sirius XM, but there's not like San Francisco channels. They could, I think in theory, offer that, but they don't. So it's interesting. Which leaves, an opportunity for terrestrial radio to go local.
Yeah.
That is one of their big deals, And the FCC was even pushing that very strongly. They were considering actually, making programming requirements to create more localism, and the radio broadcasters themselves pushed back and said, hey, now we're going to have to send you all our playlists. Who are we going to employ to actually get all that data to you? And honestly, FCC, do you have the budget for all the people that would be necessary to actually check that? And the FCC backed off because they realized, no, there's no way they could start actually enforcing that. So, they don't have the budget, and radio itself couldn't sustain it. So for now, HD radio doesn't seem to be going anywhere. Mike, did you have a hand up? Did you want to say something?
No.
Okay. Okay.
That's my fault.
All right. Okay, so now internet radio, which refers not to the streaming services, they call those netcasters in our book. So, I mean, to me, the distinction is this. Internet radio has a programmed stream that you cannot customize or personalize for yourself. So there's plenty of internet radio channels out there. And, I volunteer at KXSF, which is the old KUSF, which used to be the FM channel at the University of San Francisco. And it was sold a while back, and there was a lot of public outcry, and we did demonstrations and stuff, and whatever. We never got anywhere with that. But for quite a few years, we were a streaming-only radio station. So we weren't a Pandora or a Spotify. We just put our signal on the internet and kind of sustained ourselves. And then a few months ago, we got back on the FM dial at 102.5 FM. So gladly check you out. My kids have shows from 10 to 11 a.m. on Saturday mornings. You can hear my kids do their radio shows. They got great taste in music.
When did you find it?
Little plug there.
When did you find it?
On Saturday mornings, 102.5. There's the 8-year-old is on from 10 to 10:30, and the 12-year-old is on from 10:30 to 11. But they do play sort of alternative rock and, yeah, no kids songs, really. But, pardon me?
No shark song.
No shark song, right? Barney. We got a special on Barney this week. Ah, God. I don't know. Anybody with kids.
I have a daughter too.
Yeah,
Music is just
oh my God, yeah.
crazy.
Yeah, it is.
She was never into it, thankfully.
Yeah, the fun thing is, I think, I don't know, I love playing them like the oldies, they're into something new, and you say, well, that sounds just like T-Rex or something.
Right.
T-Rex? What? There was a band called T-Rex?
Yeah.
So in you go. But it's all, they are the future. So anyhow, the netcasters, I think we could all agree, is where, the big competition to radio as a music delivery system is there, because, anyone still with Pandora? Rick, a bit. Yeah, me too. Spotify, Apple Music, it was like, that's where it is now, right? Michael?
The quality comparison between the netcaster and the other,
And the internet radio? I mean,
if I want to have a choose among one of them.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot more money behind a Pandora, a Spotify, or an Apple Music system. So typically they'll have a less compressed signal, so they're likely to sound better. But the huge thing is, personalization. So you can say, one system or another will allow you to, I hate this song, I like this song, I hate this song, I like this song, and it will therefore, personalize the stream of music. It'll make suggestions to you. It's like your song of the week that you might want to listen to based on.
The generation marketing will dictate the more popular requests. So therefore, the Pandora will put out
Yeah.
custom titles.
It's actually pretty interesting how they work. So Pandora invested a lot of money early on in creating a several hundred tags for different musical styles. So there's a tag for a song with a prominent bass line. There's a tag for, shredding electric guitars. There's like hundreds of tags, and each song itself will have hundreds of tags attached to it. And therefore, they will look at what you like. So all of these work through you selecting what you like, what you don't like. And they will start proposing to you other songs that have those tags. The only thing is they had to hire like tons and tons of musicians who would listen to and create this giant database, which is still a big important, asset that they have, I guess. But Spotify and Apple Music work a lot more like Amazon does, which is they create a profile for you and they start comparing you against all the other users. And if you start behaving like, this profile that they've got, then they start suggesting stuff that everybody else under that profile likes. So they don't actually have to know anything about the music. It could very well be socks. It's the same system. If people your age like these types of socks in these colors, it'll start showing those to you, right? Well, in this case, it's music. If people who are have a similar set of tastes that they have represented in the system, then they'll give you more that is like those people. So it's actually a much cheaper way of organizing, a personalization system.
Are they charging per month?
They do. They have subscription fee. Yeah. How much is it? Like for
Wait.
It's $9.99.
$9.99.
But they have like a student discount for like $7, I think.
Okay, so you get a couple bucks.
Spotify does. Yeah.
Pandora used to be free if you could put up with the ads.
Same with Spotify. They have a free version as well.
Okay, I gotta get it free. I'll
Just
just,
they pay their artists like nothing.
yeah,
Like nothing. And Apple does a much better job, but they also pay them nothing.
yeah,
Like
Sure.
10 cents.
yeah.
It's something like, unless you're a big art, like on Spotify to get the equivalent of an Apple Music play of your song would have to be played 60 times.
Oh my God, really?
Yeah, so if you're a small band or whatever,
Right.
you're
Right. You're not
just
gonna
on
get
there
that
for
much.
free, basically.
Oh,
You're not
man.
getting money.
Right. So this is all part of, again, we have a week on the music business too, but the total destruction of the music business through file sharing, and then now, the few dominant services like Spotify and Apple, as you guys are saying, that, notoriously underpay the artists, right? To the point where, unfortunately, the artists with the biggest clout, Kira was talking about Beyonce and Jay-Z, basically they set up their own streaming services and even stay out of this so that they can make all the money if they want. But yeah, it is pretty tough for small bands now. I heard a hilarious podcast. This is a couple of years back. I wouldn't be able to find it. But somebody who, figured out the system. And so basically this is a fella who had his full-time job was trying to make as many kind of novelty songs as he could in a week. So he'd just be in his basement like 40 hours a week doing birthday songs, and he went through the whole catalog. So, birthday songs for Amy, birthday songs for Abraham, birthday songs for Arnold, birthday songs. So literally this person has like tens of thousands of tracks on Spotify. And you know, they only get a small number of hits when somebody wants a birthday song for, you know, James or something. But because he has tens of thousands of them, he actually makes a decent amount of money off of, because he's got like just tons and tons of tracks.
That's crazy.
And you know, he would do songs like with barf in the title and songs with burp in the title. And it's like, there's just literally just anything he could think of. Real simple songs that he would crank out like several in an hour. Legacy?
A song for every occasion.
Yeah, basically. I mean, I should dig up the podcast and try to share the link with you. But
That's smart.
It's interesting. Yeah, it's somebody who's figured it out.
Yeah.
But of course, none of us would, you know, fall in love and become a fan with that music.
Smarketing.
Michael, smarketing. That's a good one. What would you say? Oh, you're good. Oh, I thought you were, okay. Sometimes I'll get to know posture and stuff. How will they respond to inroads by netcasters? Yeah, I mean, that's really the pressing question now, and I think we talked about it last class. But any ideas about how you think terrestrial radio, that it was so grounded in music, you know, what are its options to kind of compete with those, you know, netcasters?
I hesitate about a like to pick my choice of music platform,
Uh-huh.
and because I don't have the time. But I'm looking for something that is easy accessible to me. While I'm driving a wheelchair in the subway, relatively good reception. So I think I would prefer something that I can have access through my cell phone, or my Fire, the Amazon.
Yeah, tablet or something like that.
I don't want to have a laptop on my lap just to listen to music.
Right, right.
With the Wi-Fi and also Bluetooth. That's my bit of preference. I look at all these Pandora, I sort of add on Spotify in the backstage and say, why they happen to charge? But I never think into it.
Yeah.
I hear from my classmate and you now.
Yeah.
I say, okay, I go start looking for a job in summer. I want to have something that I can mobily access to it.
Yeah.
That's why I asked the question, the dumb question, like, we should have better reception
Right. Well,
or quality.
you know,
Those two.
I think in choosing between these services, you're looking at, you know, like the library that they offer. Which one has everything you could possibly ever want to listen to? I think you're looking at price, like which one, you know, has a competitive price. Am I missing other stuff? I mean, Chris was bringing up how much do they pay artists? That's kind of an ethical concern.
And I think if he's looking for like least amount of work in organizing playlists and stuff, then probably Pandora.
No headache.
Like Pandora, they have like humans curating the radio stations that they, the playlists, whatever. Whereas Spotify, they have a radio, but it's limited in terms of the length of the stations or song playlists, whatever, and it's all algorithm based.
Uh-huh.
So I don't know, like Pandora's least amount of work for you.
Try it out.
I would test out Spotify because it's lower end for students. When they get to work, I don't mind to pay anything under $50.
Yeah.
Something like that. But I'm an anti-Apple guy. I'm not anti, but I was
Oh,
born
you're an anti-Apple guy? I heard entire. Okay, anti.
Windows 95, so I'm used to it. I shouldn't say that. So I find
So you have an Android cell phone?
too user-friendly for low-level thinking. I want to be really critical. You know, okay, which key to function. So I'm really biased to Microsoft
So
and Android platform. I think it's more.
there was a Windows phone as well, but I don't think it did too well.
As well.
But I think another thing that you bring up is also a further consideration. It's like what platform are you on? So Apple Music for your iPhone, they kind of go together. You know, versus I'm sure Amazon has all kinds of things they'd like you to get into.
I think I could just charge too much for anything they do.
Oh, that's always it. Yeah. So remind us of your name. Ruth. Yeah. Thanks, Ruth.
Well, with Apple Music, I think they do have a discount. It's like $4.99. But if you want family, it's like $14.99.
Yeah.
Another thing is like if you're like more independent and you have like what you want to listen to, then Apple Music is like less annoying because Spotify. I noticed that like I'll be listening to something and then like bring up some random music that I don't want to listen to, and I have to keep like pressing like skip and stuff. So So like Apple Music is just like everything is there. Like I get to control everything. It's way easier to use. And like because I'm like Apple.
Okay, so there's a thumbs up for Apple Music. Plus the price seems pretty reasonable.
I'm just saying this is how
Yeah.
get used to it. I should be more open-minded. But I think the big thing is the new program with Apple. I want to talk about is to have an on-screen on the windshield in a mobile in a car. It's shifting from cell phone to that. They only bought 100 acres of land to the test site. So I imagine Apple is going to focus on, okay, get into your car, voice control, pop the door open, start the engine, open the garage, open the door, sit in, check your voice message, password. So you are the owner of the car, start the engine. So you just sit there doing whatever. I would say they don't want you to touch the screen to have command as to video or GPS.
Okay, but so Michael, can we bring it back to radio though? Because that's really our topic for the week.
On it, just reach.
Absolutely. It's I think probably it's a very conceivable vision of what a company like Apple might be up to.
So they are doing it.
Yeah.
I have
Yeah.
resource really reliable.
Yeah. Well, we're aware of the various I mean, nobody could know all of the options that are out there, right? The question originally was, how could terrestrial radio try to compete against, netcasters and their ability to provide you with customized, if not curated, and sometimes curated, music streams which are tailored to what you want. So we talked about localism, and there's another thing that came up last week that Kira was talking about, but so remember personalities as well. And so Chris also mentioned Howard Stern and how he kind of propped up Sirius, and there's that's another possibility. I don't hear in these netcasters, I don't hear so much actual personality. I don't hear talk. I get a substitute for my CD player or something like that, which is incredibly mobile and stuff. Right?
I mean, what kind of personalities? I mean, BBC does this thing called Essential Mix, where they have like a famous DJ or whatever come in and they'll play like a
That sounds great.
1 to 2 hour session, and that draws a lot of audience because like
I'll check it out. Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, so, in some ways, I mean, myself personally, the way I'm adapting to all of this is I'm happy enough to listen to a podcast that originates with NPR or BBC. There's personalities that I have grown to, literally, I have this, very strong connection to them thanks to listening to them every day for years and stuff. I love to hear them interact and things, but they're not necessarily spinning records or there every morning at 8 a.m. when I drive to work, basically. So
Right.
I'm finding a lot of the same thing, but in, just in slightly different organizations. Is that what other people are feeling?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, but these are some possibilities. Terrestrial radio is not completely dead. Another thing is, from a business point of view, SiriusXM just bought Pandora. So this is in the last few months.
Really?
Yep, and somebody could look it up to find out how much money was actually, exchanged. But the other thing that we should never forget is these big companies, they're looking at the changing landscape, and they have the means in order to buy a Pandora or, to make those kinds of acquisitions. So to them, it's like, the media may be different, but they can own both, and the same way that CBS, terrestrial network with a huge, long history, as we saw, they're going to have a streaming service. They do have a streaming service, right? CBS All Access, I think that's the name of it, something like that. So they're trying to have it both ways as well, and Disney will too. So
How many terrestrial stations we have in the San Francisco Bay Area?
San Francisco Bay Area, it's less than 100. I think last time it was in the high 80s, or low 90s.
Small stations?
Pardon me?
Are they all individual?
Well, FCC rules right now caps the number of terrestrial stations at 8 within a market. So imagine iHeartRadio has 8 stations. They can't own any more in our particular market. Nationwide, there are no limits on how many they can own. So Clear Channel, that used to be iHeartRadio, they rebranded themselves because they're on their way to going bankrupt and such. At one point, they owned like 1,200 radio stations in the United States. They had a huge number of stations. Unfortunately, they took on so much debt to do that that they're forever almost going bankrupt because they can't afford those huge payments. Yeah, so there's a lot going on with them, but they still are the largest group owner. And here in the Bay Area, they've got the 8, right? Because in these big, rich communities like SF Bay Area, or New York, or Los Angeles, or Chicago, it's like this is where money is still being made in terrestrial radio. If you're a little station, in a small town, there's not much going on. But in a big market, it is. So, wow, there's just like some stuff here I would like to get to. Good Lord, it's huge. I think another important thing just to let you know about, and eventually we'll come back to it as well, in terms of copyright law, if you're a terrestrial radio station, you make a blanket deal with ASCAP, BMI, et cetera. You give them a certain amount, 10% of your operating profit, basically, and then you can play anything you like by those composers. Netcasters or internet radio, they pay a lot more in terms of copyright. And they set up something called Sound Exchange, which gathers all the money from that. And they basically pay by stream. So, the more people are streaming your stuff, the higher cost you have, versus old terrestrial radio, you just paid, a certain amount and you were clear. So there's been a lot of discussion about what's the appropriate level of royalties and which royalties to claim. Again, ASCAP only collects for composers, so performers do not get paid when their material goes on to terrestrial radio. It's only the composers that get that money. That was viewed as okay when radio sold records. You could make your money that way. But nowadays, when streaming services sell nothing tangible, and they give you only fractions of a penny per serve of your song, the performers have demanded some compensation as well. So digital radio stations and streaming services pay a performer's right as well as a copyright to the composer. So it's actually treated quite differently, and there's a lot of struggle within the industry about how much is appropriate and who should get it. And companies like iHeartRadio that are cutting out, they'll make a deal with Sony Music and pay a significantly lower right fee for anything they play from Sony, versus a small service can't do that. So there's unfair competition there potentially. At least some people say that. Cool. Okay. Well, on Thursday we like to end up with a Kahoot, and there we go. I took a little too long again. And be assured that before we do quizzes and exams, we will always review and such. So don't think that if we race through the material that you won't have a chance to focus in on exactly what is necessary to do well on the exams, because you will. We will, review stuff. But for now, we've got a Kahoot going on chapter, I guess this was chapter 2, right? Yes, talks about the Biltmore Agreement, all those things that we've talked about. So let's play a classic. And again, I hope we'll full screen it.
Yeah.
741789 is the pin. You can always go with your phone in your browser to kahoot.it, or there's a Kahoot app. And we're kind of logging in there. Awesome. Thank you, folks, for joining in. That's cool. So I'm just going to start it up, and thanks, Ruth, for coming on board. Anybody else, if you're still getting in, you can still join even as we play. You just won't get a chance to be the big winner necessarily. So David Sarnoff's radio music box memo described a way to make money from broadcast radio. True or false? Ready?
I'm always too quick to answer.
Pardon me?
I'm always too quick to answer.
Oh, is that right? How come?
I regret it.
Oh, then you start having second thoughts? Oh, I think this one is. All right, whoa, 3 and 3. Come on, guys. Okay, well, anyway, the way we've phrased it here is the way it would be phrased on an exam. So yeah, Sarnoff, remember, was the executive. He was in charge of NBC for like 50 years. He called himself the general after the Second World War, although he was never in the war. So Sarnoff, thought up the idea, what if we put music? What if radio becomes a music box in people's homes? So that was the memo. So now, radio news was controversial. The press-radio war happened, settled by the Biltmore Agreement. True or false? Okay, true. So more people got it. Remember, the Biltmore Hotel in New York was the scene where radio and newspaper representatives sat down and hammered out the agreement where radio would not play the breaking news until after the newspapers had sold their afternoon edition. Who invented FM radio? Was it Heinrich Hertz, Fessenden, Armstrong, or Marconi? So remember, we're talking about FM, right?
FM. Not P.
I'm going to skip forward. Yes. Whoa, we had equal parts everybody. Well, the answer is Edwin Howard Armstrong. So Armstrong was the inventor of FM, who, as we said, eventually had a falling out with Sarnoff over the commercialization of FM and committed suicide. Who proved that electromagnetic energy traveled through the air? So a very famous physicist. Was it Fessenden, Morse, Marconi, or Hertz? Everybody voted who wanted to? It seems like someone's logged in, but not. Okay, so yes, Hertz. Heinrich Hertz was the physicist who proved the electromagnetic energy traveled through the air. All right, who's up next? Lee DeForest, another inventor. What did he invent?
Oh, I hit the wrong one.
Letters all over this. So he didn't invent all of them.
I just hit the wrong one.
Oh no.
Same.
Well, luckily there's no credit for all this. It's just a reminder and sort of, I guess, advance warning that I'll ask you. You know, in this case, I'll be asking like the names of inventors and stuff and what they invented. So, well, we got the majority got the Audion, so that's what DeForest did. Even though he didn't really understand why it worked, he took a tube and modified it, and it turned out to be a very effective amplifier for radio signals and stuff. Okay, Congress has the right to regulate broadcasting because A, the airwaves belong to the people. B, American broadcasting system is a commercial enterprise. C, early unregulated radio generated too much noise. Or Choice D is both A and C. I hope I didn't make a mistake on this one too.
What trips me up is they switched
The colors. That's
Yeah.
why the
Yeah.
wrong one.
Ah.
Last one.
Yeah, the card.
Interesting.
I don't think it's C and it's
Is that something I can control? All right, so A, the airwaves belong to the people. That's the whole logic behind it. Okay, next up. What we today refer to as a network, what was that called in the 1920s? We're not talking about computer networks. We're talking about ABC, CBS, or NBC. So what was the word that they used? Was it chain broadcasting, spoke broadcasting, shuttle broadcasting, or maybe none of those? Not likely. Nice. So we got a solid response on that. So the idea was one signal was, it traveled a chain linking together all those different stations in the network. Prior to the Radio Act of 1927, things were bad. But what was bad? A, legislation was inadequate to regulate commercial radio. B, all radio stations broadcast on the same frequency. C, stations were encouraged to take turns broadcasting. D, all of the above. Well, we didn't give you adequate information, so I think, your guess is welcome. But we didn't tell you quite enough about this.
B.
So correct answer was all of them. They were indeed encouraged to share the same frequency and just take turns at it, which obviously wasn't going to work too well. Although, KXSF shares a license with San Francisco Public Press, and we do take turns. Like half a day it's a news service and half a day it's music. 31, Westinghouse was interested in broadcasting because it would, allow them to sell more radio receivers, make more revenue from advertising. C, improve the moral climate of wholesome entertainment. D, all of the above. So again, we didn't touch on that. So it's another guess situation. Let's skip ahead so we can get the last one. The correct answer was Westinghouse was interested in broadcasting because they could sell radio receivers. So the story about this is that after the First World War, when the different parties that were part of the radio broadcasting system and business got together, AT&T controlled the long distance lines. I remember to tell you that. NBC and CBS, so the networks controlled the content. The builders of radio sets were Westinghouse and RCA. So they basically divided it all up. So they said AT&T promised not to sell radios, and NBC just did the content. So they actually divvied up all of the possible roles and then, made a fortune doing that. Our last question, radio stations, or maybe not, radio stations profited during World War II because advertisers bought radio ads instead of print. True or false? Geez, I left out a lot of stuff. Sorry, but this keeps me honest. So it is true. They rationed newsprint during the Second World War, as they rationed many things, but the airwaves were, there. So advertisers couldn't buy enough space in newspapers, but they could advertise on the radio. So radio did great. Way to go, Christopher, CJ, and Rick. Thank you. And there was a lot of guessing. So, I will review my questions before I launch into lecture next time a little better. Sorry.
Was it cheaper to purchase ads on the radio than the...
Well, let me dismiss everybody, let them go, and then Michael, we can still chat for a sec. So remember, if you didn't do a discussion in class, the discussion online is due on Sunday, and maybe you already did it. So I'll look forward to jumping in there and see what you said. Remember, ideally, you will post in the discussion online and then come back and reply to somebody else. And if you're first, then I'm sorry, you may have to come back a little bit later to read people's stuff, but we appreciate you being first because someone's got to get in there and write some stuff. So thank you. So we'll see you next week. Tuesday is the day off, right? February 5th, we will not be meeting. There are no classes at City College on the 5th.
You know if there are
Next
classes
Tuesday.
on Monday?
Yes, there will be,
Yeah.
yeah. So the 5th is just one professional day.
Yeah.
So we'll see you next week, next Thursday.